A famous polyglot mocked a maid's daughter, daring her to translate a forgotten language. Unaware, the quiet girl carried the key to a secret no one could unlock. In a ballroom filled with the world's greatest minds, a forgotten language lay locked behind symbols no one could read. The scholars argued, confident in their brilliance, until one man sneered. Perhaps the maid's daughter would like to try? What followed shattered reputations and rewrote history. Because the girl serving tea wasn't just listening, she was understanding. Each word on that ancient tablet was a whisper from her family's past, a secret her grandfather had guarded in silence. And what started as a test meant to humiliate a child ended as a revelation that humbled the world's most celebrated linguist. This is the story of how a forgotten soldier's code and a little girl's courage gave voice to history's quietest heroes. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A forgotten language held the key, but the world's greatest minds were blind to it. Only the girl serving tea in the corner knew its secrets, a legacy from a hero they had all forgotten. The grand ballroom of the Atherton Grand Hotel was a sea of scholarly tweed and expensive perfume. It hummed with the low, confident murmur of intellects gathered for the annual International Language Symposium. Voices from a dozen countries blended into a sophisticated drone, discussing ancient grammar and obscure phonetic shifts. 12-year-old Clara moved through this world like a ghost, a small shadow in a simple black dress and a starched white apron. Her task was simple: to follow her mother, Helen, with a tray of delicate porcelain teacups and ensure no esteemed academic went without refreshment. For 6 hours, she had performed this duty with a quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. It was exactly as her mother had instructed. Keep your head down, sweetie. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. We are here to serve, not to be seen. Clara understood. In this room, she and her mother were part of the furniture, functional and silent. Yet, Clara couldn't help but listen. Her mind, a sponge for words, soaked in the fragments of conversation floating past her. She heard debates on Proto-Indo-European roots, arguments over the syntax of Aramaic dialects, and laughter at jokes told in fluent Mandarin. To her, it was a symphony, each language a different instrument playing a beautiful, complex melody. Clara balanced her tray as she passed a cluster of professors gathered around a large display screen at the front of the room. The keynote address was in less than an hour, and a nervous energy had begun to replace the earlier calm. At the center of the group stood Dr. Alastair Finch, a man whose reputation was as large as his personality. He was tall and imposing, with a sweep of silver hair and a voice that commanded attention even at a whisper. He was the star of this symposium, a celebrated polyglot who claimed fluency in over 30 languages. He gestured impatiently at the image on the screen, a photograph of a weathered stone tablet covered in strange, angular symbols. It's simply baffling, a younger academic, Dr. Marcus Thorne, admitted, pushing his glasses up his nose. The morphology doesn't align with any known language family. The symbols have some pictographic elements, but they don't correspond to any registered script. Dr. Finch let out a short, condescending laugh. Nonsense, Marcus. Every language has a root. You're just not digging deep enough. It's clearly a variant of a pre-Sumerian isolate, likely from the Zagros Mountains region. The challenge is not in identifying it, but in deciphering its unique grammatical structure. He spoke with an air of finality, as if his hypothesis were already a proven fact. Clara paused for a moment, her gaze fixed on the screen. The symbols were not strange to her. They were as familiar as the letters in her worn storybooks at home. Her heart gave a small, excited flutter. The lines and dots felt like old friends. She could almost hear the words they formed, a low, melodic cadence in the back of her mind. It was the language of her grandfather's stories, the secret words he would whisper to her on the porch during quiet summer evenings. "Clara, what are you doing?" Her mother's voice was a sharp, worried hiss from behind her. Helen rushed to her side, her face creased with anxiety. "You're staring. Get back to the kitchen. The next round of pastries will be ready." "But Mama," Clara whispered, her eyes still glued to the screen. "I know those words." Helen's hand clamped down gently, but firmly on her daughter's shoulder. "Hush now. This is not our world. You are imagining things. She steered Clara away from the group of professors, her expression a mixture of fear and stern love. To her, a child's imagination was a dangerous thing in a place like this, a spark that could attract the wrong kind of attention. She could not afford to lose this job. As they retreated toward the swinging doors of the hotel kitchen, Dr. Finch's booming voice followed them. The key phrase appears to be this sequence here, he announced, pointing a laser at a specific line of text. Once we crack this, the rest of the tablet will unfold. I expect to have a preliminary translation ready for my address tonight. It will be, if I may say so, revolutionary. His colleagues murmured in admiration. Clara, however, felt a small knot of unease in her stomach. She knew what that line said, and she knew that Dr. Alastair Finch, for all his fame and brilliance, was completely and utterly wrong. Back in the steamy heat of the kitchen, surrounded by the clatter of dishes and the scent of baking bread, Helen checked her daughter's apron, smoothing it down with trembling hands. You must not do that again, Clara. Do you understand me? Daydreaming is for home. Here, you must be alert. You must be invisible. I wasn't daydreaming, Mama, Clara insisted softly, her blue eyes earnest. Grandpa Sam used to draw those symbols for me. He told me stories in that language. He called it the tongue of the silent mountains. Helen sighed, her shoulders slumping with a weariness that went beyond her long hours of work. Her father, Captain Samuel Miller, had been a decorated war hero, but he had come back from his service a changed man. He was quiet, haunted by memories he rarely spoke of, and he often retreated into a world of his own, a world that included the strange language he taught his only grandchild. Helen had always seen it as a harmless eccentricity, a game between an old soldier and a little girl. She never imagined it could be real. Your grandfather was a wonderful man, Clara, but his stories were just that, stories. Now, please, take this tray of sandwiches to the main hall. And this time, no stopping. Clara nodded obediently, her blonde hair catching the harsh fluorescent light. She picked up the heavy silver tray, her small arms straining slightly. As she pushed through the kitchen doors and back into the grand ballroom, she felt a profound sense of conflict. Her mother's warning echoed in her ears, a plea for safety and invisibility. But her grandfather's voice was there too, a gentle whisper from her memory, telling her that words had power and that truth was worth speaking, no matter how small the speaker. The atmosphere in the ballroom had grown thick with tension. The hour of the keynote address was drawing near, and it was clear that Dr. Finch's confidence had been premature. He now stood by the screen, his face flushed, arguing in hushed but frantic tones with Dr. Thorne and an elegant, older woman Clara recognized as Professor Eleanor Vance, a respected historical linguist. The syntax is impossible, Dr. Finch hissed, running a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair, dislodging a few strands. If this verb is intransitive, then the entire clause collapses into nonsense. It cannot be what it appears. Perhaps our assumptions about the root are flawed, Alastair, Professor Vance suggested, her voice calm and measured. She had a kind face, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of a life spent smiling and thinking deeply. Perhaps it is not an isolate from the Zagros region at all. The symbolism bears a passing resemblance to some unclassified scripts found in post-war reconnaissance files from the Aleutian Theater. Dr. Finch scoffed dismissively. Eleanor, please. You and your military archives. This is ancient, not some modern battlefield jargon. We are talking about the dawn of language, not the echoes of some forgotten skirmish. Clara moved closer, her duties forgotten. She placed her tray of sandwiches on an empty table, her hands moving on autopilot. She could see the specific phrase they were struggling with. Kalantor, Veshanel, Norimath. She mouthed the word silently. The translation was immediate in her mind, a simple, profound truth. Where the river sleeps, the mountain dreams. It wasn't a description of a place, but a philosophical statement, a piece of poetry. Dr. Finch was trying to read it as a map. He was looking for nouns and verbs, for literal meaning, when the language was built on metaphor. Grandpa Sam had explained it to her once. You don't just say the sun sets, he had told her. You say, the day star bows to the night queen. You have to feel the picture, not just read the words. Dr. Thorne, looking pale and stressed, wrung his hands. The symposium's benefactor, Mr. Davenport, is expecting a groundbreaking reveal. The press is here. If we can't even translate a single line, I will handle it, Dr. Finch snapped, his composure cracking. His professional pride was on the line. He had built a career on being the man who could decipher anything, the master of all tongues. To fail now, so publicly, was unthinkable. He turned away from his colleagues, pacing in a tight circle. His angry gaze swept the room, looking for something, anything, to distract from his own mounting failure. And then his eyes landed on Clara. She was standing a few feet away, her tray abandoned, her face a mask of intense concentration as she stared at the tablet on the screen. He saw not a child, but a convenient target for his frustration. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his lips. He strode toward her, his footsteps loud in the suddenly quiet room. All conversation had stopped as the attendees watched the drama unfold at the front. Well, Dr. Finch announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It seems we have another expert in our midst. The serving girl appears to be captivated. He stopped in front of Clara, looming over her. She shrank back, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tell me, child, he said, gesturing dramatically toward the screen. You've been staring at this tablet so intently. Do you have an insight to offer us? Perhaps you've cracked the code that has stumped the world's greatest linguistic minds. A wave of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the audience. Clara felt her face burn with humiliation. She looked for her mother, but Helen was nowhere to be seen, likely still in the kitchen. She was alone. Leave the girl alone, Alistair, Professor Vance said, her voice sharp with disapproval. This is beneath you. On the contrary, Eleanor, Dr. Finch retorted, his eyes glinting. He was enjoying the spectacle, redirecting his own failure into public mockery. I am simply exploring all possibilities. In our field, we must remain open-minded. He crouched down slightly to look Clara in the eye, his voice a low, patronizing drawl. Go on. Don't be shy. Tell us what the ancient stones say. What great mystery does this line hold? He pointed the laser at the phrase again. Kalantor, Veshanel, Norimath. Clara swallowed hard. Fear and shame warred with a fierce, protective love for her grandfather's language. This man was butchering it. He was twisting its beauty into something ugly and nonsensical. He was making a mockery of the stories and secrets she held so dear. Her grandfather's words came back to her, spoken on a night when he was feeling sad and lost in memory. Words are all we have left in the end, little sparrow. They're the only things that truly last. You have to protect them. She took a small, shaky breath. All the lessons about being invisible, about keeping her head down, faded away. She looked not at Dr. Finch, but at the glowing symbols on the screen. In a voice that was barely a whisper, yet clear as a bell in the silent room, she spoke. You're reading it wrong, she said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked from the grand ballroom. Dr. Alistair Finch's smirk froze on his face. He slowly straightened up, his expression shifting from mocking amusement to sheer, unadulterated disbelief. What did you say? He stammered. Clara found a sliver of courage. She lifted her chin and looked him directly in the eye. I said, you're reading it wrong, she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. It's not a map. It's a poem. From the back of the room, a gasp was heard. Helen stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, a tray of pastries clutched in her hands, her face a mask of pure terror. She had come to see what the commotion was, only to find her daughter at the very center of it, defying the most powerful man in the room. Professor Vance stepped forward, her expression one of intense, cautious curiosity. She looked at Clara, then at the screen, then back at Clara. A poem? She asked gently, her voice an invitation, not a challenge. How do you know that, dear? Before Clara could answer, Dr. Finch let out a bark of incredulous laughter. He had recovered from his initial shock and was now marshaling his defenses, cloaking his wounded pride in a renewed wave of condescension. A poem? Of course. How foolish of us. We bring in geolinguists, semioticians, and paleographers, when all we needed was the literary analysis of a 12-year-old girl. This is absurd. He turned to the audience, spreading his hands wide as if to say, Can you believe this? We are wasting valuable time. The child is confused. Perhaps she overheard us discussing poetics earlier. But Professor Vance did not look away from Clara. She saw something in the girl's steady gaze, a quiet certainty that could not be easily dismissed. "Let her speak, Alistair," she said firmly. "What kind of poem is it, child?" All eyes were on Clara. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Her hands trembled, so she clasped them behind her back. She thought of her grandfather, of the strength in his weathered hands and the kindness in his tired eyes. He had faced down enemy soldiers. Surely, she could face down a roomful of professors. "It's about how everything is connected," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke the familiar concepts. The first word, Kalantor, doesn't mean river. Not exactly. Kalan is the spirit of flowing water, and Tor means to be at rest or to sleep. It's about potential, the power of the river when it's still. She glanced around the room. The faces staring back at her were no longer mocking. They were intrigued. Dr. Thorne was leaning forward, listening intently. Even the reporters at the back of the room had raised their notepads. "And the last word, Norimath," she continued, "is not mountain. Nori is the soul of the stone, its ancient memory. And math means to see in slumber, to dream. So the mountain isn't just a place. It's an ancient being that holds all the memories of the land. The river rests so the mountain can dream of all that has passed." She took a breath, the full translation now clear in her mind, polished by years of hearing it in her grandfather's gentle voice. "Where the spirit of water sleeps, the soul of stone dreams." A collective sigh went through the room. The phrase, which had been a meaningless jumble of symbols, was suddenly transformed into something beautiful and profound. It resonated with a deep, mythic quality that was undeniably authentic. Dr. Finch stood as if turned to stone, his face pale. His complex, academic deconstruction had been swept aside by a child's simple, elegant explanation. He saw his revolutionary discovery, his keynote address, his very reputation, crumbling before his eyes. "That's impossible," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Where would you have learned this? Who are you?" Before Clara could answer, a man in a tailored suit who had been watching from the side of the stage stepped forward. It was Mr. Davenport, the symposium's primary organizer and benefactor. His expression was one of complete astonishment. "Young lady," he said, his voice respectful, "please come with us." He gestured toward a small conference room just off the main stage. Professor Vance moved to Clara's side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," she murmured. "We just want to understand." As they guided Clara away from the gawking crowd, Dr. Finch was left standing alone in the spotlight, his laser pointer hanging limply at his side. The great Polyglot had been silenced by a whisper, and the symposium, which had been on the verge of a tedious academic failure, was now on the cusp of a revelation far more profound than anyone could have possibly imagined. The small conference room was an oasis of silence after the charged atmosphere of the ballroom. It was furnished with a heavy mahogany table and plush leather chairs that smelled of polish and old paper. Mr. Davenport closed the door, shutting out the buzz of excited speculation that had erupted among the symposium attendees. Along with Professor Vance, a stunned Dr. Thorne had followed them in, his academic skepticism now replaced by a wide-eyed wonder. Clara's mother, Helen, was ushered in last, her face pale with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. She immediately went to her daughter's side, wrapping a protective arm around her. "I am so sorry, sir," Helen began, her voice trembling. "She's just a child. She has a wild imagination. I don't know what she was thinking, speaking out like that. Please, don't hold it against her. It won't happen again." Mr. Davenport held up a hand, his expression not angry, but intensely serious. "Mrs. Miller," Helen supplied. "Helen Miller. Mrs. Miller, please. Your daughter is not in trouble. We are not angry. We are astonished." He pulled out a chair for Helen and Clara. "Please sit down." Clara sat, her small feet barely touching the thick carpet. Professor Vance sat opposite her, leaning forward with a gentle, encouraging smile. "Clara," she began, her voice soft, "what you set out there was remarkable. You spoke with such certainty. Dr. Finch has spent months with that tablet. Our best cryptographers have been working on it. None of them saw what you saw. You must tell us how you knew this language." Clara looked at her mother, who gave a slight, nervous shake of her head. The instinct to obey, to retreat into silence, was strong. But the dam had broken. The words, so long held inside, wanted to be spoken. My grandpa taught me, she said quietly. He was Captain Samuel Miller. At the mention of the name, Professor Vance's eyes widened in recognition. Dr. Thorne, who had been pacing near the window, stopped dead in his tracks. Samuel Miller? Dr. Thorne breathed, his voice filled with awe. The Samuel Miller? The ghost of the Aleutians. Helen looked baffled. I don't know about that. He was a captain in the army. He served during the war. He didn't talk about it much. Professor Vance's gaze was fixed on Clara, a new and profound understanding dawning on her face. Samuel Miller is a legend in certain military history circles. He was part of a special intelligence unit operating in the Aleutian Islands campaign. It was a brutal, forgotten theater of the war. His unit was instrumental in several key victories, but their records were sealed after the war, classified at the highest level. They were said to have used an unbreakable code. She paused, looking from Clara to the closed door, as if she could see the tablet on the screen through it. We always assumed it was a complex cipher. A machine, perhaps, like the Enigma. But there were rumors, whispers of something else. Something older. A native dialect that was spoken by only a handful of individuals. A language with no written record, no formal grammar. A language that could not be broken because no one outside the unit even knew it existed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with breathtaking speed. The unbreakable code wasn't a code at all. It was a living language. He called it the tongue of the silent mountains, Clara offered, her voice now steady. He said the mountains taught it to the first people, and they passed it down in secret. He was stationed near a village there. An old woman, one of the last elders, she saw something in him. She taught him. He said it was the only thing that kept his heart from freezing in that cold. The room was silent for a long moment as the weight of her words settled. The stone tablet was not an ancient artifact from Mesopotamia. It was a relic from the 20th century. It wasn't a poem about a mythical landscape. It was a message, written in a language of metaphor and spirit, by a soldier. Can you read the rest of it? Mr. Davenport asked, his voice hushed. Clara nodded. We need to bring the tablet in here, Dr. Thorne said, already moving toward the door. No, wait. It's too delicate. We'll bring up the high-resolution scans on the monitor in here. While Dr. Thorne hurried out to make the arrangements, Helen Miller looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. The secret world she had shared with her father was not a fantasy. It was real, a piece of history that these important people were desperate to understand. The stories, the strange words, the symbols drawn on scrap paper, it had all been real. He never told me, Helen whispered, her eyes welling with tears. He carried all that with him, and he never told me. He didn't want to burden you, Mama, Clara said softly, patting her mother's hand. He said some memories are too heavy to share. He just gave me the best parts. The stories. Soon, Dr. Thorne returned, and the large monitor on the conference room wall flickered to life, displaying the image of the tablet in crisp detail. All eyes turned to Clara. The weight of expectation in the room was immense, but she no longer felt afraid. She felt right. This was what Grandpa Sam had prepared her for, without either of them ever knowing it. She stood up and walked to the screen, her small finger tracing the lines of text. It starts here, she said. It's a letter. She began to translate, her voice clear and confident. She did not just read the words. She channeled the spirit behind them. The formal, academic setting of the conference room melted away, replaced by the windswept, frozen landscape of a forgotten war. To the one who finds this, Clara began, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. Let these words be my witness. The winter has taken our fire, but not our spirit. The Sunhawk has flown south for the last time. We are few now. The whispers on the wind carry the names of our fallen brothers. She paused, her finger moving to the next line. Sergeant Peters fell when the snow lion roared. That means he died in an avalanche. They didn't have a word for avalanche, so they described the sound it made. Professor Vance was scribbling furiously in a notebook, her expression a mixture of scholarly focus and deep, human emotion. Dr. Thorne simply stared, mesmerized. Clara continued. Corporal Chin's spirit thread was cut by the shining fawn. A shrapnel wound. The language doesn't have words for modern weapons. Everything is described through nature. Her voice was unwavering as she translated the litany of loss and survival. The tablet was a memorial, a final message from Captain Miller's lost unit. It detailed their last stand, their dwindling supplies, and their unshakable resolve. It was filled with grief, but also with a profound sense of peace and acceptance. She came to the final lines of the text, her voice softening. We leave our stories in the heart of the stone, so that the mountain can dream of us. Tell my family I have gone to walk in the silent mountains, where the rivers of memory sleep. Do not weep. A soldier's duty ends, but his spirit flows back to the land he protected. She looked down at the last symbol, a simple, elegant mark at the very bottom of the tablet. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. What is it, Clara? Professor Vance asked gently. It's his sign-off, she whispered. Samuel, who listens to the sparrows. That's what the elder called him. It was his name in their tongue. She looked at her mother. He used to call me his little sparrow. Helen was openly crying now, silent tears of sorrow and pride streaming down her face. In that moment, her father was no longer just the quiet, haunted man from her childhood. He was a hero, a poet, and a keeper of a sacred trust that he had passed on to his granddaughter. Mr. Davenport, a pragmatic man of business and philanthropy, cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously moist. This is the most extraordinary discovery in the history of this symposium, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This isn't just a new language. It's a window into a piece of lost American history. It's a testament to the soldiers who fought a war we have all but forgotten. He looked at Clara with profound respect. Young lady, what you have done here tonight is more than a simple translation. You have given these men their voices back. Just then, the door to the conference room opened. Dr. Alastair Finch stood there, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He had clearly been listening from the hallway. The sounds of his world shattering had been too quiet to hear from the ballroom, but in the silence of the corridor, they must have been deafening. He had not come to challenge or mock. He had come, it seemed, to witness the final confirmation of his own irrelevance in this matter. He looked at Clara, at the tear on her cheek, at the ancient wisdom in her young eyes. He saw the rapt faces of his colleagues and the tear-streaked face of the maid who had been invisible to him just an hour before. In that moment, he wasn't a celebrated polyglot or a renowned academic. He was just a man who had been so blinded by his own brilliance that he had failed to see the simple truth right in front of him. The language, he said, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual booming confidence. It's beautiful. It was the closest he could come to an apology, an admission of defeat, and a statement of genuine awe. Professor Vance turned to him. Alastair, she said, her tone not unkind. We have work to do. We have a history to rewrite. And, she added, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder, I believe we have found our keynote speaker. Clara's eyes widened. Speak. In front of all those people? But looking around the room, at the faces filled with respect and gratitude, she felt a new kind of strength blossoming in her chest. It was the strength of her grandfather, the legacy of the silent mountains, and the power of words that had waited decades to finally be heard. Her mother squeezed her hand, her grip now firm with pride, not fear. For the first time that evening, Clara felt truly visible, and she knew she was ready to tell her grandfather's story. The grand ballroom had been rearranged. A single lectern now stood on the stage, bathed in a soft, solitary spotlight. The large screen behind it was no longer a source of academic frustration, but a sacred canvas, displaying the silent, powerful words of the stone tablet. Mr. Davenport had insisted. The world needs to hear this, he had declared, his usual business-like demeanor replaced by a fervent sense of historical duty. And they need to hear it from the one person on earth who can give it voice. Clara stood in the wings, her mother fussing with the collar of her simple black dress. The apron was gone, a symbol of a life that had been shed in the space of a single hour. Helen's hands still trembled, but now it was with a nervous, electric pride. Are you sure you're okay with this, sweetie? She whispered, her eyes searching Clara's face. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Clara looked out at the sea of faces filling the ballroom chairs. The room was packed, far more crowded than before. Word had spread like wildfire through the hotel. Reporters and journalists, who had initially come for a dry academic announcement, now stood at the back, cameras ready, sensing a story of immense human interest. She saw Dr. Thorne in the front row, his notepad open, a look of profound respect on his face. She saw Professor Vance, who gave her a small, confident nod. She even saw Dr. Finch, sitting off to the side, no longer in the center of attention, looking smaller, more human. Grandpa Sam would want them to know, Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. He wrote it down so they wouldn't be forgotten. Helen hugged her daughter tightly. He would be so proud of you, Clara. I am so proud of you. Mr. Davenport stepped up to the lectern to introduce the unexpected keynote speaker. His voice boomed through the sound system, filled with a gravitas the evening had previously lacked. He didn't mention Dr. Finch or the initial purpose of the gathering. Instead, he spoke of forgotten heroes, of the sacrifices of war, and of a history that had been lost to the ice and snow of the Aleutian Islands. And tonight, that history has been given back to us, he concluded, his voice ringing with emotion. Not by a celebrated academic, but by a young girl who carried a precious legacy in her heart. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce you to Miss Clara Miller. A wave of applause, warm and sincere, filled the room as Clara walked onto the stage. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but her gaze was fixed on the image of the tablet. The strange, angular symbols felt like a comforting presence, the last tangible piece of her grandfather. She took a deep breath, clutching the small, worn copy of his favorite poetry book that her mother had pressed into her hand for courage. She did not start with an academic explanation. She started with a story. My grandfather didn't talk much about the war, she began, her voice amplified by the microphone, yet retaining its soft, intimate quality. But he talked about the cold. He said it was a living thing, a beast that tried to steal the breath from your lungs and the memories from your mind. He said the only way to fight it was with stories. Words were their fire. They were their food. They were the only warmth they had. She recounted the tales her grandfather had told her, not of battles and violence, but of the small moments of humanity that had survived in the harshest of conditions. She spoke of how the men in his unit, a mismatched group of soldiers from all corners of the country, had learned the secret language from the Aleutian elder. It had become more than a code. It had become their bond, a shared world that their enemies, and even their own commanders, could never penetrate. The language doesn't have a word for soldier, Clara explained, gesturing to the screen. The closest word is kintari, which means one who stands between the village and the howling wind. Their duty wasn't to fight. It was to protect. Everything they saw, everything they did, they understood through the lens of this language, a language of nature and spirit. She then began to walk the audience through the tablet, line by line, just as she had done in the conference room. But now, she elaborated, giving context from the stories her grandfather had shared. She explained that the snow lion that had killed Sergeant Peters was not just an avalanche, but a specific, recurring one on a treacherous mountain pass that the men had personified as a hungry predator. The shining fong that had wounded Corporal Chun was not just shrapnel. It was from a specific type of mortar shell that glinted in the Arctic sun before it landed. Each translation was a small, vivid brushstroke, painting a picture of life and death on a forgotten front line. The audience was captivated, hanging on her every word. There was no sound in the room but Clara's voice and the soft scratching of reporters' pens. Dr. Finch sat motionless, his face etched with a complex mixture of regret and professional fascination. He was witnessing the birth of a new field of study, one he had completely missed because he had been looking at the grammar and not the soul. This section here, Clara said, pointing to a dense block of text in the middle of the tablet, is where my grandfather lists the names of the men who were lost. But he doesn't just list their names. He writes a small poem for each one, a memory to honor their spirit. She began to read them, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the forgotten grief. Private David Chun. His laughter was a string of bright copper bells. The wind remembers their song. Sergeant Michael Peters. He stood as strong as the mountain's spine. Now he sleeps in its heart. Corporal Elias Vance. His stories were a warm blanket in the endless night. We wrap ourselves in their memory. In the front row, Professor Eleanor Vance let out a small, sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Elias Vance. It was her grandfather's name. He had been listed as missing in action in the Aleutians in 1943. His body was never recovered. All her life, she had known him only as a faded photograph on her grandmother's mantelpiece, a handsome young man in a uniform, a ghost in her family's history. Tears streamed down her face as Clara continued to read. It was a message in a bottle, a final goodbye from a lost world, delivered 70 years later by a 12-year-old girl. Her life's work had been the study of dead languages, the careful reconstruction of forgotten histories. She had never dreamed that her own history was lying dormant on a piece of stone, waiting for the right person to read it. Clara finished her presentation with the final, heartbreaking lines of her grandfather's letter. She spoke his sign-off, Samuel, who listens to the sparrows, and then looked up from the screen, her own eyes misty. My grandfather came back from the war, but a part of him never left the silent mountains, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He taught me this language so that the stories of his brothers, the men he loved, would not be lost forever. He wanted the mountain to dream of them. And tonight, thanks to all of you, the whole world can dream of them, too. She took a step back from the lectern. For a moment, there was a profound, breathless silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a sacred truth, a shared moment of human connection that transcends time and place. Then, the applause began. It started not as a thunderous roar, but as a single clap from Professor Vance, who had risen to her feet, her face a testament to her family's recovered history. Then another clap, and another, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, the applause swelling into a sustained, overwhelming ovation. It was not applause for an academic breakthrough. It was a tribute, a thank you. It was for Clara, for her grandfather, and for the lost soldiers of the Aleutian campaign whose spirits had finally been brought home. In the chaotic aftermath, Clara was swept into a whirlwind. Reporters clamored for interviews, their microphones and cameras creating a thicket around the small stage. Mr. Davenport and a team of hotel security formed a protective circle around Clara and her mother, guiding them back to the quiet sanctuary of the conference room. Professor Vance joined them, her eyes red but shining with a fierce, joyful light. "You have given me a gift beyond measure, Clara," she said, taking both of Clara's hands in her own. "You have given me back my grandfather." She explained that Elias Vance had been a writer and a poet before the war. The description on the tablet, "His stories were a warm blanket in the endless night," was the man she knew from her grandmother's memories, brought to life with heartbreaking clarity. Dr. Thorne entered the room, his face flushed with excitement. "The discovery is already hitting the news wires," he announced, holding up his phone. "They're calling it the Sparrow's Code. The historical implications are immense. This changes everything we thought we knew about cryptography in the Pacific Theater." Helen Miller sat in a daze, trying to process the seismic shift that had just occurred in her life. An hour ago, she was a maid, worried about keeping her job. Now, she was the mother of a girl who had just rewritten history. She looked at Clara, who was handling the sudden attention with a quiet grace that seemed far beyond her years. The invisibility Helen had so desperately sought for them was gone forever. In its place was a spotlight, bright and daunting. The door opened again, and Dr. Alastair Finch stepped inside. The room fell silent. He looked haggard, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, leaving him looking older and smaller. He did not look at his colleagues. He looked only at Clara. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice raspy. I came to offer my sincerest apology. What I did out there, my behavior, was inexcusable. It was born of pride and ignorance. I was presented with a truth I was not equipped to understand, and I responded with cruelty. There is no excuse for it." He took a shaky breath. "Your knowledge, your grandfather's legacy, is a treasure. I hope that, in time, you will be able to forgive my professional blindness and my personal failure." Clara looked at the man who had tried to humiliate her. She saw not a monster, but a man humbled by a truth he could not deny. She remembered something her grandfather had once told her. "A smart man knows what he knows. A wise man knows what he doesn't." Dr. Finch, perhaps for the first time in his life, was learning wisdom. "Thank you," she said simply. Her forgiveness was quiet, but absolute. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of momentous decisions. Mr. Davenport announced the creation of the Samuel Miller Grant for Endangered Language Studies, with Clara and Professor Vance as its inaugural chairs. The stone tablet, which had been a private collector's anonymous loan, was to be donated to the National Archives, where it would be displayed as a national treasure. Government officials were already calling, requesting access to the translation for a potential declassification of the related military records. Professor Vance, with Clara's help, would lead the project. A new chapter in American history was being written, and a 12-year-old girl was its lead author. Late that night, long after the crowds had dispersed and the ballroom had fallen silent, Clara and her mother were escorted to the hotel's presidential suite, courtesy of a grateful Mr. Davenport. It was a world away from their small apartment across town, with its sprawling rooms, soft carpets, and a window that overlooked the entire city. Clara stood by the window, looking at the distant lights. In her hand, she clutched the small poetry book. Her life had changed forever in the course of a single evening. She was no longer just the maid's daughter. She was the girl who could speak the language of the silent mountains, the keeper of the sparrow's code. Helen came and stood beside her, wrapping her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "What are you thinking about, sweetie?" "About Grandpa Sam," Clara replied, her voice soft. I think he's finally at peace. His brothers aren't lost anymore." Helen hugged her close, her heart overflowing with a love and pride so immense it felt as if it might burst. The world had seen her daughter as a servant, a ghost in the halls of power and intellect. But she had a hero's blood in her veins and a poet's soul in her heart. The forgotten language had held the key, not just to a piece of lost history, but to Clara's own future. The world's greatest minds had been blind, but the girl who served tea in the corner had seen everything. She had listened to the sparrows, and in doing so, she had taught the world to hear their song. The legacy of a hero they had all forgotten was now a story that would never be lost again. 6 months later, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom in Washington, D.C., their soft pink and white petals drifting like snow in the gentle spring breeze. From her new office window at the National Archives, Clara could see them blanketing the tidal basin, a vibrant symbol of renewal. It had been 6 months since the night at the symposium, 6 months that felt like a lifetime. The world had changed, and so had she. Her office was not large, but it was hers. It was filled with books on linguistics and military history, maps of the Aleutian Islands, and high-resolution photographs of the stone tablet, now known to the world as the Miller Stone. A plaque on her door read, "Clara Miller, Research Fellow, Special Project on Indigenous American Code Talking." It was a title that still felt slightly unreal, like a costume she was trying on, but the weight of the responsibility felt right on her shoulders. Professor Vance, Eleanor, as she now insisted Clara call her, stuck her head in the door, her face bright with excitement. "They're here, Clara. The first batch of declassified files just arrived from the Department of Defense. A whole truckload of them." Clara's heart gave a familiar leap of anticipation. This was the core of their work now. Guided by the translations from the Miller Stone, the government had begun the slow, arduous process of unsealing the records of Captain Samuel Miller's unit. Each new file was a piece of a 70-year-old puzzle, a ghost given a voice. They spent the rest of the day in the main research room, surrounded by stacks of manila folders stamped with bold, red, top secret, warnings that had only recently been crossed out. The air smelled of old paper and history. For hours, they pored over after-action reports, censored letters, and faded reconnaissance photos. With the Miller Stone as their Rosetta Stone, they could now understand the coded communications that had baffled analysts for decades. A report from 1943, previously a jumble of nonsensical phrases, now read as a clear and urgent message. "The snow lion roars on the western pass. We have lost 3 men. Send sky canoes with medicine thread. An avalanche has blocked the pass. We have 3 casualties. Requesting an airdrop of medical supplies." "Look at this," Eleanor murmured, pushing a file across the table to Clara. It was a personnel file for Corporal Elias Vance. Inside was a faded photograph of the handsome young man from the mantelpiece. Tucked behind it was a small, folded piece of paper, a poem he had written, filled with imagery of the unforgiving but beautiful landscape. It was a personal effect that had been returned with his file, its significance lost on the original processing officers. Eleanor read it with tears in her eyes. Another piece of her grandfather returned to her from the mists of time. Clara found her own grandfather's file. Inside, she found the official report on the unit's final days, a cold, bureaucratic account that stood in stark contrast to the poetic memorial on the stone tablet. But there was also a letter he had written to his parents, Clara's great-grandparents, a letter that had been held by censors and never sent. "Tell everyone I am well," it read. "The work here is hard, but the land has a spirit that gets inside you. I have met a people here who speak the language of the mountains. They have taught me much. I hope to bring their stories home with me, if the wind is kind." He had brought the stories home. He had carried them in his heart and passed them on to her. Reading the words in his familiar, looping script, Clara felt a connection to him that was deeper than ever before. Their life outside the archives had transformed as well. They now lived in a comfortable townhouse in Georgetown, a world away from their old, cramped apartment. Helen Miller had quit her job at the hotel on the very night of the symposium. She no longer had to be invisible. She was now the proud manager of her daughter's burgeoning career, handling press inquiries, scheduling interviews, and fiercely protecting Clara from the overwhelming glare of the media. The story of the Sparrow's Code had captured the world's imagination. It was a tale of a forgotten war, a secret language, a lost hero, and the unassuming granddaughter who brought it all to light. Clara had become a reluctant celebrity. She had been on the cover of magazines and interviewed on national television. Schools were adding sections on the Aleutian Campaign to their history curricula. The surviving families of the other men in Captain Miller's unit had reached out, expressing their profound gratitude for finally learning the true story of their loved ones' last days. But for Clara, the most important part of her new life was the Samuel Miller Grant. The next day was the first ever meeting of its selection committee. The grant had been flooded with applications from linguists, anthropologists, and historians around the world, all proposing projects to study and preserve endangered languages, from the disappearing dialects of the Amazon rainforest to the last remaining speakers of ancient Polynesian tongues. The meeting was held in a grand boardroom at the Davenport Foundation. Clara sat at the head of the table, flanked by Eleanor, Mr. Davenport, and a panel of esteemed academics, including a newly humbled and deeply respectful Dr. Finch. He had become one of the grant's most ardent supporters, his earlier arrogance replaced by a genuine passion for the cause. He now understood that the study of language was not about collecting fluencies like trophies, but about preserving the unique cultural souls of humanity. As they reviewed the proposals, Clara listened with a wisdom that belied her 13 years. She looked not just at the academic merit of each project, but at its heart. She championed a proposal from a young woman who wanted to live with the last two speakers of a nomadic Siberian dialect, not just to document their grammar, but to record their songs, their folklore, their dreams. Languages aren't just lists of words, Clara argued, her voice clear and steady, echoing the lessons her grandfather had taught her. They are how people see the world. When a language dies, a whole way of seeing dies with it. We have to save the pictures, not just the words. Dr. Finch nodded in vigorous agreement. "Miss Miller is precisely correct," he added, his voice now carrying a tone of mentorship rather than authority. "We must fund projects that capture the ethos of a language. Its poetry, its humor, its soul. A dictionary without stories is just a list of bones without a body." The committee listened, and they agreed, funding not only the Siberian project, but also one to create a digital archive of oral storytelling from a fading coastal language in Ireland. Later that evening, after the meeting had concluded, Clara walked with her mother along the edge of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. The Washington Monument stood like a sharp white needle against the deep blue of the twilight sky. "It was a good day," Helen said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "All those people, from all over the world, listening to you. It's still hard to believe." "Grandpa Sam did the good thing," Clara corrected softly. "I'm just his messenger." "You're more than that, sweetie," Helen said, stopping to look her daughter in the eye. "You're his legacy. You gave his words a home." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the city glitter on the water. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind, a dizzying ascent from obscurity to fame. But here, in the quiet of the evening, she felt a sense of profound peace. She was not just the maid's daughter, nor was she just the girl who had stunned the world. She was Clara Miller, the granddaughter of Samuel, who listens to the sparrows. She had found her own voice by giving voice to the past, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her work, her grandfather's work, was only just beginning. The silent mountains had shared their secrets, and now, the world was finally ready to listen. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.